So the Red House Mystery by A.A. Milne is a real curiosity because, of course, A.A. Milne is the author of Winnie the Pooh, which is what he's famous for, but he wrote one crime novel, and it's a very good one. So what's kind of surprising is that he never wrote another one. It's a classic sort of golden age mystery, almost in a P.G. Wodehouse mode. It's quite comical, but it has a very, very clever idea at its root about how to commit a crime. And without giving too much away, what happens at the beginning of the book is one person is murdered, and someone else, someone who would maybe have liked to have murdered that person, has disappeared. So what you're seeing is someone who's committed a homicide has run away, and that's sort of hiding the truth of the crime. So I've always thought that was a very clever book, and I was happy to use it. So Malice of Forethought by Francis Iles or Alexander Berkeley Cox. I mean, you get back into some of these Golden Age writers, and they have several names. Is a great poisoning story, and it's also a very I think it's known as an early reverse crime book. I think they call it something like that, because ultimately the criminal is revealed at the very beginning, and it really focuses on the criminal, which is a husband wanting to kill his wife, and he's a doctor, so he knows a lot about poisons, but he doesn't really he does sort of a remarkably vicious thing, which is the way he kills his wife off is by first getting her addicted to painkillers, and then sort of making it known around town that she's become a painkiller addict, and then using that against her to create what looks like an accidental overdose. So it's quite vicious. It's actually quite funny in a very dark way. And it was good to get, one book with a solid poison. You got to have a good poisoning if you're going to have a list of fictional murders. So the ABC Murders by Agatha Christie has always been one of my favorites of hers, particularly for the brilliant idea of the plot, which is what's happening is there's been a string of murders, and it's sort of Anthony Adams in Andover, and I'm making these up, and Betty Berkeley from Brighton are getting killed, and what it looks like is there's a homicidal maniac on the loose who's flipping through the postal book or what have you, and picking out people with these specific names to kill them off. So they're racing around trying to figure out who might be next. But this string of murders is hiding a much more sort of devious crime beneath it. So again, I thought much of these books that I picked have it's a misdirection behind them, that it looks like one thing and it's actually something else. And I think that's what A Perfect Murder is about, is concealing, of course, not just the murderer, but maybe concealing the victim in a way. So Double Indemnity is, again, I came to it first as the movie, as a sort of a teenage lover of film noir, so I always loved that story. Eventually read the book and read all of James M. Cain, the hard-boiled mid-century American writer who also wrote Postman Always Rings Twice. It's a great misdirection book, where, and like most of James M. Cain's books, murder springs from passion. So in this case, it's an adulterous couple that want to kill off the husband of the woman in the love triangle, and they concoct this plan where it's made to look as though the husband will have fallen off the back of a train and broken his neck. And they come up with this very clever way of doing that by having the lover, the killer in this case, sort of pretend to be the husband on the train, so there'll be witnesses. It's a if it works, it is a perfect murder. Of course, it's something that's like fraught with. I mean, all of these perfect murders are in a way imperfect murders because they all get caught out in the end. But in this case, if it had gone right, it was quite brilliant. Of course, these things go wrong. So, Strangers on a Train by Patricia Highsmith, a book I've always loved, a book I've referenced in a previous novel of mine, Kind Worth Killing, which is the classic murder swap, which is, two people each have a murder they want to commit. But if that murder is committed, they'll be the most likely suspect. So why not swap murders and make sure that the likely suspect is far away from the victim as possible? Again, a sort of perfect murder in theory. I think in reality, one fraught with problems, mainly that someone else knows your secret. But it was brilliantly done in Strangers on a Train. I've always loved that concept. And that was one of the books that as soon as I came up with a concept for rules for perfect murders, I knew that I had to include that. So The Drowner by John D. MacDonald is probably a less familiar name to UK audiences, and at this point in US audiences, I think it's a less familiar name unless maybe your dad had a slew of Travis McGee novels on his shelf, because John D. MacDonald was hugely popular, and he wrote a series of Travis McGee books, which were detective stories, and he also wrote standalones. And I think he's been a little bit forgotten, which I think is a shame because he's a brilliant writer, really a distinctive voice, and he was a huge influence on me. So I definitely knew I had to include one of his books, and I included a rather strange standalone he wrote in which there's a murderer who is a drowner, as you would know from the title, and comes up with this very clever way to drown people, to make it look as though it was an accidental drowning, and it's a little over the top, but a lot of fun, and yeah. So I definitely knew I had to include a John D. book. So Deathtrap, of course, isn't a book; it's a play. Ira Levin is one of my favorite writers. Of course, the writer of Rosemary's Baby and Stepford Wives, although my favorite book of his is A Kiss Before Dying, his debut novel, which is a thriller. But I've always loved Deathtrap, and I've always loved the initial murder in that, it's just so clever. And it is actually a murder that you would never be able to pin on anybody, because you're essentially causing a death that looks like a natural death, and I won't give away any more of that. This, of course, all plays out on the stage, but I've always loved it. I've always loved stage thrillers in general, and this was... So I cheated, of course. It's not a book, but it is a play, and in fact, you can buy the play and read it, so like a book, which I've done, so there's that. The Secret History by Donna Tartt was the last book I included in the list, and one of the things, I was making the list myself, but I was also having Malcolm Kershaw, the main character in the book, make the list, and he says at one point, I did want to include something contemporary or fairly contemporary into the book series, book list, because I think when you are creating a book list, and I do quite a bit myself as an author, a bit from Golden Age, a bit from mid-century, and a bit from contemporary. So I'd always loved Donna Tartt's Secret History, and I did remember that there was this clever thing, and I'm not giving away any spoilers in this one because this is a book that tells you right up front who's killed. It's in the first sentence that this group of students have killed a fellow student named Bunny, by pushing him off a cliff during his hike. But the way they sort of, so the book is much more about why they did that and then the ramifications for that. But the way they set up the murder is they decide that they'll let they'll let Bunny choose his own murder, in the sense that he goes out on these long rambling walks and they'll just wait for him at a place he might arrive to. And they figure if he does, they can push him off. If he doesn't, they can't. It's really a huge, massive rationalization. They're still out to murder him. But there's this sort of very clever idea that they think, then in retrospect, people will be like, oh yeah, he always walked past that. He occasionally walked past that dangerous part, and they would get away with it that way. So I did think there was a concealment and a clever crime embedded in that book.